A new beginning in Maplewood Estates. When Daniel and Lisa Carter first laid eyes on Maplewood Estates, they thought they had finally found their dream home. Nestled in a quiet suburban town with tree-lined streets and charming houses, it was exactly what they envisioned for their growing family. Lisa, a schoolteacher, loved the idea of a safe and friendly neighborhood where their daughter, Sophie, could ride her bike without worry. Daniel, an engineer, looked forward to finally having space to work on his passion projects, building custom furniture in his garage. But what they didn't know, what the smiling real estate agent conveniently failed to mention, was that Maplewood Estates was ruled by an iron-fisted homeowners association, HOA, led by a woman who saw herself as nothing less than a queen. Her name was Margaret Holloway, but everyone called her HOA Karen behind her back. Margaret had been president of the HOA for over a decade, and in that time, she had turned what was once a friendly neighborhood into her personal kingdom. No detail was too small for her to enforce. She measured grass lengths with a ruler, inspected holiday decorations for violations, and even dictated the color of people's front doors. If you so much as left your trash bins out 1 minute past pickup time, she was ready with a fine. And now, the Carter family had unknowingly walked right into her domain. The first warning, the first hint of trouble came just days after they moved in. Lisa was outside planting flowers in their front yard when a shadow loomed over her. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice. Lisa looked up and saw a woman in her late 50s, dressed in a stiff beige suit, holding a clipboard like a weapon. "I'm Margaret Holloway, president of the Maplewood Estates HOA." She said it with pride, as if she were introducing herself as the leader of a nation. "I wanted to welcome you to the community." Lisa smiled warmly. "Oh, thank you. It's great to be here." "I couldn't help but notice," Margaret interrupted, "that your flowers don't conform to Section 5.4 of the HOA guidelines. Only white and pastel-colored flowers are allowed in front yards. Those red roses, well, they simply don't fit." Lisa blinked. Was this woman serious? "They were my grandmother's favorite," Lisa said, trying to keep the conversation light. "I just thought they'd brighten up the yard." Margaret smiled, a tight, artificial smile. "I understand, but rules are rules. I'll give you a week to remove them before I issue a formal notice." And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Lisa standing in her own yard in disbelief. The mailbox incident. A week passed, and Lisa kept her flowers. Maybe Margaret would just forget about it. She didn't. Instead, a bright yellow notice was posted on their front door, a fine for non-compliance. Lisa and Daniel were stunned. Was this woman really policing flowers? That was just the beginning. A few days later, Daniel received an official violation letter regarding their mailbox. Apparently, the black metal mailbox that had come with the house was outdated and aesthetically displeasing. The HOA mandated standard white mailboxes, all identical in design. "I refuse," Daniel said, tossing the letter on the counter. "This is absurd." "She'll fine us again," Lisa warned. "Well, two can play this game," Daniel said, a mischievous glint in his eye. That night, after putting Sophie to bed, Daniel pulled up his laptop. If Margaret wanted a mailbox change, he'd give her a mailbox change. After hours of research, Daniel found the perfect solution: a reinforced steel mailbox, the kind used in high-crime areas to prevent mail theft. It was solid, unbreakable, and weighed nearly 200 pounds. The next weekend, Daniel installed it himself. He poured concrete into the base, added steel reinforcements, and secured it with industrial-grade bolts. By the time he was done, the mailbox looked normal on the outside, but it was, quite literally, indestructible. When Margaret saw it, she was furious. "This is completely unacceptable," she snapped, standing in their driveway. Daniel crossed his arms. "You said I needed a new mailbox. This one meets federal regulations." Margaret's face turned red. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," she hissed before storming off. The meltdown. For weeks, Margaret seethed about the mailbox. It wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was personal. She hated being challenged, and Daniel had not only defied her, but outsmarted her. Then came the breaking point. One evening, Margaret was power walking through the neighborhood, muttering to herself about insubordinate homeowners. That's when she saw it, Daniel's mailbox, standing strong, mocking her. In a moment of blind rage, she marched right up to it. Lisa, watching from the kitchen window, saw the unthinkable. Margaret grabbing a rock from a nearby flower bed and hurling it at the mailbox. Keelang. The rock bounced off without a scratch. Margaret growled and kicked it. Pain shot up her leg, but she wasn't done yet. With wild determination, she picked up a bigger rock and lifted it over her head. Daniel, hearing the commotion, stepped outside just in time to see Margaret swing the rock with all her might. There was a sickening crack, not from the mailbox, but from Margaret's wrist. She let out a piercing scream, clutching her arm as she staggered backward. Neighbors began to step outside, drawn by the ruckus. Margaret, humiliated and in pain, turned and fled down the street, cradling her injured wrist. Daniel stood there, watching her retreat, before bursting into laughter. Lisa, stepping outside, shook her head in disbelief. Did she just attack our mailbox? Daniel grinned. She sure did. And for the first time since moving in, they felt something they hadn't felt since arriving in Maplewood Estates. Victory. The HOA's wrath. When power turns to obsession, Margaret Holloway had never been humiliated like this before. For 10 years, she ruled Maplewood Estates with an iron fist, ensuring that every blade of grass, every mailbox, and every color scheme bent to her will. But now, Daniel Carter and his indestructible mailbox had become a symbol of rebellion, and Margaret Holloway was not a woman who forgave rebellion. The night after her failed assault on the steel-reinforced mailbox, she sat in her home, icing her swollen wrist, seething with anger. She would not, could not, let this stand. This was now about more than HOA rules. This was about power. And Margaret never lost. The HOA strikes back. The next morning, Lisa Carter was drinking her morning coffee when she heard the distinct sound of a car engine idling outside. She walked to the window and froze. There, in front of their house, was Margaret, standing beside a clipboard-wielding squad of HOA board members. Behind them was a tow truck, a code enforcement officer, and a landscaper with a chainsaw. Lisa's stomach dropped. "Oh no," she muttered, rushing to wake Daniel. By the time Daniel got outside, Margaret was already barking orders. "Violation 6.2, mailbox non-compliance," she announced, pointing at their steel-reinforced mailbox. "Schedule immediate removal." Daniel smirked. "You'll need a demolition crew to remove it." Margaret's lip curled. "Oh, don't worry," she snapped. "That's exactly what I brought." She turned to the tow truck driver, a burly man who looked deeply uncomfortable. "Hook it up," she ordered. The driver hesitated. Ma'am, this thing looks." "Do it," Margaret screeched. The driver sighed and got to work. He wrapped a heavy-duty chain around the mailbox and hooked it to the back of the massive tow truck. Lisa held Sophie's hand tightly as they watched. This was insane. "This woman is nuts," Lisa whispered. Daniel just folded his arms, watching with pure amusement. "Go ahead," he said. "Give it a shot." The driver climbed into the tow truck and revved the engine. The truck roared to life, its tires screeching as it tried to yank the mailbox from the ground. Nothing. The truck lurched forward, but the mailbox didn't budge an inch. Daniel smiled. Margaret's eye twitched. The driver tried again, pushing the truck to maximum torque. The chain groaned, the truck's wheels spun, but the mailbox remained completely unmoved, as if it were rooted into the earth itself. Then, bang! The chain snapped, whipping backward and smashing into the front of Margaret's pristine white SUV, shattering the windshield. There was a moment of absolute silence. Then Margaret let out a horrified screech. Daniel grinned. The tow truck driver paled. Yeah, I'm not messing with this," he muttered, throwing up his hands. The code enforcement officer, who had been pretending to take notes, took one look at Margaret's car and slowly backed away. Margaret was livid. "This isn't over," she spat, her face red with fury. Daniel just shrugged. "Oh, I know," he said, "because you never know when to quit." Margaret stormed off, leaving behind her cracked windshield, snapped chain, and a neighborhood full of spectators who were secretly cheering for the Carters. Karen's next move: the HOA dictatorship. But Margaret wasn't just angry. She was obsessed. Over the next few weeks, she launched an all-out campaign against the Carters. She fined them for imaginary violations, things like excessive noise when Sophie laughed too loud in the yard. She called the city about zoning violations, only to be laughed off the phone when inspectors found nothing wrong. She sent threatening HOA letters weekly, demanding the removal of the mailbox under emergency rule changes. Nothing worked. And that's when Margaret crossed the final line. The midnight raid. One night, at 3 a.m., Daniel was woken by a strange clanking sound outside. He sat up, heart pounding. Lisa stirred beside him. "Did you hear that?" Daniel pulled back the curtain, and his jaw dropped. There in the dead of night was Margaret Holloway, dressed in all black, holding a sledgehammer. She had hired 2 local teens, kids desperate for cash, to help her destroy the mailbox. One of them lifted a crowbar and took the first swing. Clang! The steel mailbox didn't even dent. Margaret growled, "Hit it harder, you idiots." Daniel grabbed his phone, already recording. This was too good. The second teen swung the sledgehammer. Bang! The vibration rattled the teen's arms, and he yelped in pain, dropping the hammer. Daniel burst out the front door, phone in hand. Well, he said, grinning. "What do we have here?" Margaret's head snapped up like a deer caught in headlights. "You!" she shrieked. Daniel held up his phone. "This is trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of property," he said, "and I have it all on video." Margaret's face drained of color. One of the teens bolted into the night, leaving Margaret and the other kid standing frozen in place. The sound of police sirens filled the air. Lisa stepped onto the porch, arms crossed. "You really should have quit while you were ahead," she said. As the police car pulled up, Margaret panicked. "This is a mistake," she shrieked, stepping back. It was a maintenance check. The officer raised an eyebrow. At 3 a.m, with a sledgehammer, Margaret was arrested on the spot. The remaining teen, shaking with fear, spilled everything. How Margaret had offered them money to destroy the mailbox, because she couldn't let Daniel win. As Margaret was being led away in handcuffs, Daniel couldn't resist. He walked up to her, leaned in, and whispered, "You lost." And for the first time in her life, Margaret Holloway had nothing to say. The fall of a tyrant, when the HOA turns on its queen. Margaret Holloway had never imagined this day would come. As the police car pulled away from Maplewood Estates, sirens flashing in the dark, she sat in the back seat, wrists bound in cold steel cuffs. The humiliation burned hotter than the pain in her still swollen wrist. Arrested, on her own street, in front of the very people she had controlled, dictated to, and bullied for years. This wasn't supposed to happen. This couldn't happen. She was the HOA president, the law of the neighborhood. And yet, as she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the police car window, her usual haughty expression was gone, replaced with something she had never truly felt before. Fear, because she knew this wasn't just an arrest. This was the beginning of the end. The neighborhood awakens. By the next morning, word had spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had spent years living in fear of Margaret's outrageous fines, power trips, and bullying began to talk. People who had whispered their frustrations behind closed doors were now openly sharing stories. The retired couple on Primrose Lane who had been fined $500 for having their Christmas lights up a day too long. The young family on Cedar Drive who had been forced to remove their children's swing set because it was unsightly. The single mother on Maplewood Court who had to repaint her entire house twice because Margaret kept changing the HOA-approved colors. Margaret had ruled with an iron fist for years, and now that fist was collapsing. And at the center of it all, Daniel Carter, the man who had stood up to Margaret when no one else dared, the man who had outsmarted her at her own game, the man who had planted the seed of rebellion. And now, the neighborhood was fully awake. The HOA coup. When the board rebels. By mid-afternoon, the HOA board members, who had once been Margaret's loyal enforcers, were suddenly nowhere to be found. Daniel sat on his front porch, sipping iced tea, as he watched several of them quietly sneak out of their homes, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Then the real show began. An emergency HOA meeting was called, without Margaret. The meeting was held in the neighborhood's community center, and to everyone's surprise, nearly every homeowner showed up. The atmosphere was electric. Margaret's second-in-command, a stiff, nervous-looking man named Harold Simmons, stood at the podium, clearing his throat. We're here to discuss the, unfortunate situation regarding our HOA president. A voice from the back of the room called out. You mean the lunatic who got arrested for attacking a mailbox? Laughter erupted across the room. Harold visibly shrank, adjusting his tie. Well, yes, that. From the front row, a woman stood up. It was Mrs. Lillian Patterson, the 72-year-old widow who had lived in Maplewood Estates longer than anyone. Enough of this nonsense, she said, voice steady and strong. Margaret has run this neighborhood like a dictator for too long. It's time for a vote of no confidence. A ripple of agreement spread through the room. Daniel leaned forward, watching the spectacle unfold. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Within minutes, the vote was called. All in favor of removing Margaret Holloway as HOA president, effective immediately. Hands shot up. Dozens. Then more. Then nearly every hand in the room. It was unanimous. Margaret Holloway was officially removed from power. A cheer erupted through the community center. For the first time in a decade, the people of Maplewood Estates felt free. Margaret's return, a queen without a kingdom. 3 days later, Margaret came home. After being released from custody, she expected to return to her throne, confident that the HOA would have stood by her side. She pulled into her driveway, her SUV still dented from the mailbox incident, and immediately sensed that something was wrong. For one, no one came to greet her. Normally, neighbors would pretend to respect her, offer polite nods or hurried hellos, whether out of fear or forced obedience. Now, people were out in their yards, laughing and chatting like she didn't even exist. Margaret stormed toward her house, only to find something even worse. A large white envelope taped to her front door. She snatched it off and ripped it open. Her eyes widened in horror. It was an official HOA notice. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties as HOA president. Furthermore, due to violations of the HOA code, you have accrued the following fines. $2,500 for property destruction, damaged mailbox attempt. $1,200 for unauthorized landscaping changes, trespassing on Carter property. $3,000 for misappropriation of HOA funds, under investigation. Total due, $6,700. Failure to pay within 30 days will result in foreclosure proceedings. Margaret stumbled backward. Foreclosure? She had spent years weaponizing the HOA, and now they had turned those very same weapons against her. This was impossible. She looked up, hands shaking, and locked eyes with Daniel Carter. He was standing on his porch, arms crossed, watching. And then he smiled. Not a smirk, not an arrogant grin. A genuine, calm, victorious smile. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. But deep down she knew. She had lost. And for the first time in her miserable, power-hungry life, there was nothing she could do about it. The desperate queen's last stand. Margaret Holloway sat in the dimly lit living room of her once pristine home, the glow from a single table lamp casting eerie shadows across the walls. Her HOA throne was gone. Her control over Maplewood Estates had crumbled. And worst of all, she was $6,700 in debt to the very organization she once ruled. She gritted her teeth as she stared at the fine notice in her hands. It was a cruel joke, she thought. She had spent years enforcing rules, fining residents, threatening foreclosure, and ruthlessly upholding order. And now she was the one facing foreclosure. Her own rules had turned against her. But Margaret Holloway wasn't a woman who accepted defeat. Not now. Not ever. If she was going down, she would take everyone with her. The lawsuit, Margaret Strikes Back. By the time the HOA board members arrived at the Maplewood Estates office the next morning, they were met with a shocking sight. A stack of legal documents sat on the receptionist's desk, bound together with thick red tape. A lawsuit, filed by none other than Margaret Holloway. The claims were as outrageous as she was. Wrongful termination as HOA president, defamation of character, financial damages for emotional distress, unjust fines imposed without proper HOA procedure, harassment from Daniel Carter and other residents. The amount she was demanding, $100,000. When news of the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood, people were furious. "She's out of her mind," one neighbor muttered. "She's just trying to drag us all down with her," another said. But Daniel Carter, he just laughed. Daniel's counterattack, playing the long game. When Daniel received his copy of the lawsuit, he barely glanced at it before tossing it onto his workbench in the garage. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "That's it? You're just ignoring it." Daniel smirked, wiping his hands with a rag. "Oh, I'm not ignoring it," he said. "I'm handling it." Lisa frowned. "Daniel, please tell me you're not about to make things worse." "Oh, I'm not," Daniel assured her. "She is." Lisa sighed. "That's what I'm afraid of." But what she didn't realize was that Daniel had been preparing for this moment all along. While Margaret had been busy destroying her own reputation, Daniel had been building a case of his own, the secret that could end Margaret forever. Over the next few weeks, while Margaret paraded around like a wronged queen demanding justice, Daniel quietly dug into her past as HOA president. And what he found was devastating. It turned out that Margaret hadn't just been a terrible HOA president, she had been a corrupt one. HOA funds were missing, thousands of dollars in miscellaneous expenses, with no clear records. Suspicious transactions, large sums withdrawn in cash from HOA accounts over the years, contracts awarded to companies owned by Margaret's friends, overpriced landscaping, maintenance fees, and security upgrades that were little more than an excuse to siphon money. The more Daniel uncovered, the worse it got. Margaret hadn't just been a tyrant. She had been embezzling money for years. And the best part, Daniel had proof. The courtroom showdown. When the lawsuit finally reached court, Margaret entered with confidence, dressed in her most expensive suit, her nose in the air as she prepared to destroy her enemies. Daniel, meanwhile, walked in calm and collected, carrying a single manila folder. From the moment the case began, Margaret went on the attack. She painted herself as the victim, a diligent HOA president who had been betrayed by an ungrateful community. She claimed that Daniel had led a malicious campaign against her, rallying the neighborhood into turning against her. She called him a bully, a liar, a troublemaker. She played the role of the wronged leader, trying to claw back her power. Then it was Daniel's turn. And he didn't just defend himself. He obliterated her. He calmly handed his evidence folder to the judge and watched as Margaret's smug expression began to fade. Bank statements, showing thousands of dollars withdrawn from HOA accounts. Invoices, fake payments to companies that never actually did work in the neighborhood. Witness statements, from former board members who had been pressured into silence by Margaret for years. Margaret's face drained of color. The judge flipped through the documents, his expression growing graver by the second. Margaret opened her mouth, trying to interrupt, but the judge held up a hand. "Mrs. Holloway," he said sternly, "you might want to remain silent, because if these allegations are true, you're not just losing this lawsuit." He looked her directly in the eyes. "You're going to jail." Margaret collapsed into her chair, face ashen, her entire world crumbling around her. The judge didn't even bother entertaining her lawsuit. It was dismissed on the spot. Instead, the judge ordered a full investigation into Margaret's finances, an investigation that would lead to criminal charges. Margaret Holloway, once the self-proclaimed queen of Maplewood Estates, was now facing prison time for fraud and embezzlement. The final blow. Karma comes knocking. By the time Margaret left the courtroom, she was a wreck. Her lawsuit was gone. Her money was gone. Her power was gone. And soon, her house would be gone too. Because, with her fines unpaid and her criminal case pending, she had 30 days before the bank foreclosed on her home. The neighborhood she once ruled had turned against her. She was alone. And as she packed up her belongings, stuffing years of arrogance into brown cardboard boxes, she heard one final sound that would haunt her forever. A familiar, steady sea-lang. The sound of Daniel Carter's indestructible mailbox standing firm. The very thing that had set her downfall in motion. And for the first time in her miserable, self-important life, Margaret understood the one thing she had never learned. Some battles aren't meant to be won. Some people aren't meant to be controlled. And karma always wins in the end. The final reckoning. 1 year later. The ghost of Margaret Holloway. 1 year had passed since Margaret Holloway's fall from power. A full year since she had been dragged from her throne, stripped of her HOA dictatorship, and humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. And now, she was gone. Her grand house, the one she used to patrol from like a queen in her castle, was foreclosed months ago. Her beloved HOA, her precious power, her iron grip over Maplewood Estates, all gone. The only legacy she left behind was a cautionary tale. Don't be a Margaret. That was the inside joke between residents now. Whenever someone complained about an HOA rule, neighbors would chuckle. Well, at least we don't have a Margaret anymore. Her name had become a warning, a reminder that tyranny never lasts forever. But while Margaret Holloway had disappeared, her story was far from over. Because some people never learn. The return of the Queen. It started as a rumor. Someone claimed they saw Margaret at a gas station on the outskirts of town. Then another said she was renting an apartment under a different name. Then came the letter. One morning, Daniel Carter found an envelope taped to his indestructible mailbox. No return address, no stamp, just his name, written in familiar, rigid handwriting. Lisa found him staring at it, unopened. "Daniel, what is it?" He handed her the envelope. Lisa froze when she saw the handwriting. No way. Daniel tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in angry, uneven handwriting. "This isn't over. You stole everything from me. I will return, and when I do, you will regret it." No signature, no name. But they both knew exactly who had written it. Lisa exhaled slowly. "She's back." Daniel grinned. "I was hoping she would be." Margaret's new plan. The HOA rebellion. While Margaret no longer lived in Maplewood Estates, she was not done fighting. She had spent a year licking her wounds, plotting her revenge, waiting for her moment to strike. And then she found it. The new HOA leadership had been doing well, actually listening to homeowners, making real improvements, The neighborhood had never been happier. But Margaret saw something else. Weakness. The HOA had rules, but they weren't being enforced with an iron fist anymore. Margaret believed that without her, the neighborhood had become chaotic, sloppy, undisciplined. She wanted control back. And this time, she had a new strategy. She began secretly rallying a small group of old HOA loyalists, people who missed the order of her reign. They met in private Facebook groups, whispering about taking the neighborhood back. Margaret began planting stories, rumors that the new HOA was failing, that residents were complaining behind closed doors, that Maplewood Estates needed strong leadership again. Then came the biggest twist. Margaret bought a house, a tiny rundown property on the edge of the neighborhood. And by law, that meant she was a resident again. And residents could run for HOA president. Margaret was coming for her throne. Daniel's counterattack, the unbreakable defense. Lisa was pacing in the kitchen. She's running for HOA president. Are you kidding me? Daniel leaned against the counter, smirking. Let her. Lisa's eyes widened. Daniel, we cannot let her get back in power. She won't, Daniel said, calm and confident. She thinks she's playing chess, but she's walking into a trap. Lisa frowned. What do you mean? Daniel pulled out a file folder from a locked drawer. I've been waiting for this moment, he said. Inside the folder were documents, photos, records, evidence of Margaret's past corruption, illegal HOA dealings, and all the things she wanted forgotten. She thinks she's going to sneak her way back into power, Daniel said, grinning. But this time, I'm going to make sure she never comes back. The HOA election showdown. The day of the HOA elections was the biggest neighborhood event in years. People who had never attended a meeting before showed up, eager to see how it all played out. Margaret, dressed in her finest beige suit, took the podium with a smug smile. She spoke with authority, making promises of restoring order and fixing what was broken. She painted herself as the true leader of Maplewood Estates, claiming that without her, the neighborhood had fallen into disarray. Some people nodded along, but others shifted uncomfortably. Then it was Daniel's turn. He didn't just talk about Margaret's past. He showed them. Projected onto a massive screen behind him were bank statements, fraud reports, stolen HOA funds, and proof of her past crimes. Then he played a recording. A secret audio clip of Margaret, taken during her final HOA days, saying, "These people are idiots. They don't deserve to make decisions. They should just follow my rules and keep their mouths shut." The room fell silent. Then came the outrage. Shouting. Betrayal. The very people Margaret had tried to win over were now turning against her. Daniel stepped forward and smiled. "I think we've heard enough." Margaret, her face pale, stormed off the stage. She didn't even wait for the vote, because she already knew the result. And when the final tally came in, Margaret Holloway received 0 votes. Not even from her own supporters. Her reign was over. For good. The end of Margaret Holloway. Margaret didn't stay in Maplewood Estates after that. She packed up her belongings for the second time and disappeared into obscurity. No one knew where she went. No one cared. The neighborhood moved on. Daniel and Lisa sat on their porch that night, watching Sophie ride her bike in the driveway, the indestructible mailbox standing strong in the sunset. Lisa sighed happily. She's really gone. Daniel grinned, leaning back in his chair. She was never strong enough to stay. And with that, Margaret Holloway became nothing more than a bad memory. A cautionary tale. A story told in whispers. And Maplewood Estates. It thrived. Because in the end, some things are truly indestructible. The legend of the indestructible mailbox. 10 years later, Maplewood Estates had changed. The streets were wider now, lined with newer homes and modern streetlights. Families thrived. The community stronger than ever. But some things, Some things never changed. The indestructible mailbox still stood exactly where it had been a decade ago, a silent reminder of the war that had once been fought here. Most of the younger residents had never known about Margaret Holloway. To them, the mailbox was just a weirdly overbuilt structure, a neighborhood landmark. But to the older residents, to those who had lived through the reign of Margaret, it was so much more. It was a symbol, a monument to resilience. And soon, its legend was about to grow once more. The unexpected visitor. It happened on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Daniel Carter, now in his early 50s, sat in his workshop, tinkering with an old wooden chair when he heard the knock. Lisa, now grayer but still just as sharp, answered the door. A few seconds later, she called out, "Daniel, you're going to want to see this." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and stepped into the doorway. And then he saw her, a young woman in her 20s, standing on their porch. She had short auburn hair, piercing green eyes, and an unmistakable posture, one that seemed familiar. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said hesitantly. "I'm looking for Daniel Carter." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "That's me." The young woman exhaled sharply, as if she had finally found what she was searching for. "My name is Rachel Holloway," she said, "and I need your help." Daniel felt the air change. Lisa stiffened beside him, because they knew that name. Holloway, as in Margaret Holloway. The truth about Margaret Holloway. Daniel led Rachel inside, sitting her down at the dining table. He studied her carefully. She didn't have Margaret's cruel eyes. She didn't have her arrogance or sharp tone. But there was something in her expression, something that made it clear that this wasn't just a casual visit. Rachel took a deep breath. "I know who you are," she said, looking at Daniel. "I know what happened between you and my grandmother." Daniel and Lisa exchanged glances. "Grandmother?" Lisa asked. Rachel nodded. "She's dead," Rachel said quietly. 2 years ago." Daniel didn't react. He simply leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Lisa, however, let out a soft sigh. "I didn't know," she admitted. "I'm sorry." Rachel gave a small, almost bitter smile. "Don't be." Daniel tilted his head. "So why are you here?" Rachel hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out an old, worn leather notebook. She placed it on the table. "This belonged to Margaret," Rachel said. Daniel eyed it suspiciously. "What's in it?" Rachel pushed the book toward him. "Everything. Margaret's confession." Daniel hesitated, then opened the notebook. The pages were filled with Margaret's sharp handwriting, but it was different from how she wrote her HOA violation notices. It was messy, uneven, real, and as Daniel read the first page, he felt his breath catch. "I was wrong. I lost everything. But I deserved it. I didn't see it at the time. But now I understand. Daniel Carter didn't ruin me. I ruined myself." Daniel blinked. He turned the page. "For years, I told myself I was protecting the neighborhood, that I was keeping order. But the truth is, I was just controlling people because I was afraid of losing control of my own life. And Daniel Carter was the first person to stand up to me." He flipped through more pages, entries detailing Margaret's rise to power, her hatred for being challenged, and eventually, her regret. Daniel slowly closed the notebook. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked Rachel. Rachel took a deep breath. "Because she wrote something else," she said, near the end. She flipped to the last page and pointed. Daniel read silently. "If I could go back, I'd say this to him. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. The mailbox wasn't indestructible. He was." Daniel's chest tightened. It wasn't a victory speech. It wasn't a bitter rant. It was an admission of defeat and a final, quiet respect. For the first time since the war with Margaret, Daniel felt something shift. Rachel's request. Rachel folded her hands in her lap. "I never met Margaret in her prime," she admitted. She was already sick by the time I got old enough to understand her. She took a deep breath. But I want to know who she really was. Daniel thought about it. Margaret had been a tyrant, a control freak, a woman so drunk on power that she destroyed herself. But she was also, at the end of it all, just a person. A woman who realized, far too late, that she had wasted her life fighting battles that didn't matter.